Marco Rossi wasn't supposed to outsmart Ferrari, especially not in front of a room full of elite engineers, and certainly not with a handmade copper sleeve carved in a basement workshop. Laughed out of class and sabotaged by his own professor. He walked away humiliated, his fix labeled Garage Fantasy. But when the same engine that mocked him lands in Ferrari's lap and refuses to start, one name echoes through their halls: Marco. Now, as red engines roar and reputations teeter, the question spreads like wildfire. How did the quiet mechanic know what billion-dollar machines missed? What else is he hiding? With the world watching, Marco must prove that genius doesn't come from titles, it comes from listening, but someone still wants him silenced. Even as a boy, Marco didn't play with toys the way other children did. While they were kicking footballs across cobbled alleyways, Marco sat behind his father's small garage, holding a broken carburetor like it was a puzzle from God. His father, old Giuseppe Rossi, ran Rossi Motori, a grease-stained corner shop 2 streets down from the Ferrari test track. The red beast would thunder by every week, testing their limits just out of reach. "I swear the way you look at that thing," his father once joked, "you'll fall in love with an engine before you fall in love with a girl." Marco just smiled, already lost in the intricacies of vacuum lines and valve springs. He wasn't like the other kids, not just because of his calloused fingers or the constant scent of oil clinging to his clothes. Marco listened. He listened to engines, like people listen to lullabies. He could hear hesitation in the combustion, anxiety in a whining belt, heartbreak in an old piston's clatter. To him, engines didn't just run. They spoke, and in his little world, he spoke back. When his mother died of cancer at 13, it was an engine that got him through it. A 1968 Fiat 124 Spider with a cracked block and rusted valves abandoned in the garage for years. He poured every tear, every hour, and every ounce of his grief into that car. Not to restore it, he couldn't afford all the parts, but just to make it breathe again. On the night it finally idled, purring like a cat in his trembling hands, Marco cried for the first time in months. Not out of sadness, out of understanding. He hadn't just fixed a machine. He'd resurrected a soul. By 18, he'd rebuilt more engines than most full-time mechanics. He never used manuals unless he had to. Instead, he'd press his ear to the hood, eyes closed, fingers dancing along the metal. His father watched with a mixture of pride and worry. "You've got gold in those hands," Giuseppe would say, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "But the world loves titles more than talent. Go to school, Marco. Get the paper, even if your hands already know more than their books." So Marco applied to the Politecnico di Torino, the most prestigious engineering university in northern Italy, and despite the raised eyebrows at his application photo, where he wore a mechanic's jumpsuit and held a spark plug like a scepter, he was accepted on a full merit scholarship. He arrived in Turin with oil under his nails and hope in his chest. But it didn't take long for that hope to wear thin. Politecnico was filled with wealth, of knowledge, yes, but also of privilege. Sons of executives, daughters of design house founders, students whose exposure to engines came through whiteboards and tablets, not busted knuckles and scorched sleeves. Marco felt the divide the moment he entered his first class. Professor Lorenzo Vitale was an imposing man with slicked-back silver hair, razor-sharp suits, and a smirk that could strip chrome. A former Ferrari engineer turned lecturer, he was revered for his cutting-edge theories and feared for his unyielding ego. "Engineering is not art," Vitale declared on the first day. "It is science, precision, not poetry." He swept a gaze over the lecture hall and paused when he saw Marco, who sat near the front, notebook closed, hands fidgeting with a gasket ring. "You there?" Vitale said. "Are you planning to take notes or fix my espresso machine?" The class chuckled. Marco said nothing. He just nodded once and looked away, swallowing the sting. It wouldn't be the last time Vitale singled him out. Over the months, Marco buried himself in labs and late-night sessions in the university's underused machine shop. He often skipped social events, preferring the company of torque wrenches and oscilloscopes. While others collaborated in polished labs, Marco worked alone, quiet, focused, listening to engines the way monks listened to prayer bells. Only one person truly noticed, Lila Moretti. She was the top student in the electrical systems track, sharp-tongued and sharper-minded. Where Marco was silent, Lila spoke enough for two. She called professors by first names, rewired circuit boards for fun, and carried a magnetic screwdriver in her ponytail like it was a hairpin. "You look like you're trying to resurrect Frankenstein's engine," she teased, watching Marco huddle over a sputtering single-cylinder rig. "At least let me give it a heartbeat." Over time, their mutual respect grew into a quiet friendship. She saw in him a kind of purity, someone who didn't chase praise or prestige, just performance. And he saw in her a mind that moved as fast as his hands. But not even Lila could shield him from the biggest humiliation of the year. It came in the form of a broken monster. One spring morning, Professor Vitale wheeled in a prototype Ferrari 512, a beast of an engine mounted on a dyno stand, freshly pulled from Maranello's experimental lab. "This," Vitale announced, pacing before the class, "is a gift and a test. This V12 seized last week during a dyno stress run. Ferrari hasn't diagnosed it yet. I want one of you to try." The room murmured with excitement. Vitale raised a hand. "But be warned, this is no textbook exercise. Anyone who tries and fails in front of Ferrari's engineers will not just fail this class. They will fail as an engineer." A hush fell over the room. No one moved, until Marco slowly raised his hand. Vitale's smile was thin and sharp. "Of course." And so began a sleepless week for Marco. He was granted after-hours access to the engine, and though it sat silent in the lab above, Marco chose the basement workshop, a forgotten place where real work happened without spectators. There, surrounded by faded blueprints and half-drained coffee mugs, he listened. Hour after hour, he traced the vibrations, listened to the way the seized pistons resisted movement, noted the way torque pulses echoed backward into the crankshaft housing, and one night, as rain tapped softly against the small window pane, he found it, a microscopic crack in the harmonic coupler. It wasn't enough to cause seizure until under full load it amplified resonance, feeding back into the camshaft and locking the engine. "It's not breaking," Marco whispered. "It's echoing itself into paralysis." He fashioned a solution the only way he knew, by hand. A copper alloy sleeve, custom-shaped, designed to absorb the feedback and redirect it. Not a Ferrari-level part, not something a textbook would approve, but something that listened to the engine, that understood what it was trying to say. He presented his findings 2 days later in front of the entire class. His voice shook as he explained his approach, showing diagrams sketched in pencil, his copper sleeve gleaming under the harsh lights. Professor Vitale watched, arms crossed. "Fascinating," he said dryly. "Let's see this poetic solution." Marco carefully installed the sleeve, reassembled the test rig, and connected the laptop with Lila's diagnostic script. He turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, then sputtered, then stopped. Laughter broke out. "Perhaps it was singing soprano," Vitale quipped, prompting more chuckles. "You may sit, Mr. Rossi." Marco stared at the engine, confused. It had worked, he was sure of it. But the bolt— yes, something was off. A fuel rail bolt had shifted. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He just gathered his things, his dignity, folding under the weight of mockery. In that moment, Marco considered quitting, but the engine, he could still hear it. It hadn't failed. It had been silenced. Marco woke before dawn, certain the laughter from yesterday still reverberated through the dorm walls. Turquoise light bled across Turin's rooftop tiles, but his room remained dim. The blackout curtains were a small mercy that hid his humiliation from the sun. He pushed aside the screw-littered notebook on his desk, hands shaky. Ever since Professor Vitale's public put-down, self-doubt gnawed at him with every heartbeat. He tried to drown it by replaying the test stand data in his mind, frame by frame, until fatigue blurred numbers into nonsense. Maybe the engine really had rejected his fix. Maybe the copper sleeve was just naive, exactly the garage folklore. Vitale called it. A soft knock rattled the door. Before Marco could answer, Lila Moretti strode in, laptop tucked under one arm, determination glittering in her eyes. "You didn't answer your messages," she said, dropping the computer on his bed. "So I fetched breakfast and proof." She shoved a paper bag into his hands, still warm cornetti, and flipped open the laptop. Lines of sensor data scrolled across the screen like an ECG trace. "Look here." She pointed at a timestamp seconds before the engine sputtered. Fuel rail pressure nosedives 10 bar, then recovers after shutdown. "Mechanical failures don't self-heal," Marco frowned. "So, someone loosened the rail, but I tightened every bolt twice." Lila tapped 2 fingers against the trackpad. The data rewound, zooming on a single spike. "That someone is named Lorenzo Vitale." The accusation landed like a wrench on glass. Marco's pulse surged, part rage, part relief. He hadn't failed. He'd been sabotaged. Yet a darker voice whispered, "If Vitale could humiliate you once, he can do it again." He sank onto the edge of the mattress. "Even if that's true, Ferrari arrives tomorrow. Vitale will make sure the engine stays dead. He controls the lab." Lila crossed her arms. "Only if we let him. Guerini's bringing Ferrari's data scientists. You give them undeniable proof, and Vitale's ego crumbles faster than a cheap piston ring." Marco rubbed his temples. "He'll dismiss anything I say. Then don't just say it, show it." Lila's grin was electric. "We reinstall your sleeve, torque every bolt under cameras, run the engine, and feed live resonance data straight to Ferrari's phones. They won't care about academic politics when they smell a solution to their hypercar headache." She leaned closer, voice softening. "Listen, you fixed that engine because you listened to it. Let them hear it sing." Marco stared at the copper sleeve lying on his desk, dull, almost ordinary. Yet he remembered how it had glowed under workshop lamps, humming with potential. A slow warmth spread in his chest, melting yesterday's frost. "All right," he breathed. "Let's resurrect the beast." The university buzzed like an anthill the next day. Crimson Ferrari banners hung from balconies, fluttering against stone arches. Students milled in corridors, half thrilled, half petrified. Rumors of scholarships and full-time offers swirled in hushed tones. Professor Vitale patrolled the innovation lab in a bespoke charcoal suit, barking orders to assistants as they polished aluminum surfaces until reflections looked sharper than mirrors. The silent V12 prototype sat center stage on its dyno rig, a sleeping dragon bound by cables. He turned at the sound of Marco's footsteps. For a fleeting second, something like concern flitted across Vitale's eyes, quickly recast into disdain. "Rossi," he sniffed, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his cuff, "I would strongly advise you to observe today's demonstration from the gallery. Spare yourself another poetic catastrophe." Marco's jaw tightened, but he managed a calm reply. "I intend to participate, Professor. Ferrari requested student involvement." Vitale's smile was all ice. "Your participation already cost them an hour of delays compiling a damage report. Today we showcase serious engineering." He pivoted away, conversation dismissed. Lila materialized beside Marco, clipboard in hand. "He's sweating inside, trust me," she whispered. "Arrogant types calcify under real scrutiny." Across the lab, technicians in black Ferrari polos unpacked rugged laptops. At their center moved Alessandro Guerini, tall, composed, with the quiet confidence of a man used to thunder in his ears. He greeted Vitale with a brief handshake, eyes already roving the machinery. "Professor," Guerini said, Italian lilt warm but economical, "thank you for hosting us. I understand. The power unit presented unexpected resonance issues." Vitale launched into a jargon-heavy explanation, blaming material inconsistencies and external funding delays. Anything but human error. Marco watched, stomach churning. Each deflection felt like another clamp tightening around his chances. When Guerini finished listening, he glanced toward the students huddled at the perimeter. Ferrari values fresh perspectives. After your presentation, perhaps we'll let your top candidates have a go. Vitali stiffened. Of course, though I doubt. Excellent, Guerini cut in gently, ending the debate. The room was cleared. Only senior staff remained. Vitali powered the dyno, the cranking startup dissolving into a hollow cough echoed off glass walls, exactly as planned. He clicked his tongue sympathetically, as if he too were baffled by the engine's refusal. After 20 minutes of forced diagnostics, Guerini gave a courteous nod. Grazie, Professor. May we invite the students? Vitali's shoulders twitched. Naturally, he motioned without enthusiasm. Dozens of wide-eyed undergrads poured in. Guerini addressed them. You have 30 minutes. Show us your insight. Tools are beside the stand. Safety first. A tense hush fell. No one moved. The prototype loomed huge, intimidating like a mythic trial. Finally, Marco inhaled, stepped forward, and felt gravity shift. Whispers rippled behind him. Vitali's voice, low and venomous, slipped through the hush. Remember yesterday, Rossi. Marco didn't falter. He climbed onto the service platform as Lila fed him nitrile gloves and the copper sleeve. Quickly, yet methodically, he began. First, he torqued the fuel rail bolts to spec, calling out each value as Lila recorded on camera. Then the harmonic coupler housing came off, revealing the hairline fracture glittering like a fault line. Gasps fluttered among the students. Guerini craned closer. That crack wasn't in your earlier report, Professor. Vitali hesitated. Must have propagated later. Marco's steady hands slid the copper sleeve over the coupler, aligning grooves precise as a surgeon's stitch. He replaced the housing, cinched bolts in star sequence, and connected Lila's diagnostic laptop. The interface, coded overnight, projected live resonance graphs onto the lab's main monitor. Green lines idled at 0. Tension mounted. Guerini gestured. Whenever you're ready. Marco's thumb hovered over the ignition. Sweat purled at his temple. Suddenly, every memory of failure, yesterday's laughter, years of poverty, nights spent cradling busted carburetors, pressed down on him. He closed his eyes. Beneath the metallic smell of coolant and solvents, he heard it, the engine's whisper. Not a cry of pain this time, but a low, impatient rumble, ready to breathe. Marco exhaled, flicked the starter, a single crank. 2. The V12 ignited, not with a roar, but a velvet-smooth growl. Vibrations that once rattled the frame settled into a confident purr. The whole stand seemed to inhale. On the monitor, resonance peaks remained flat, green across the board. An audible gasp rolled through the lab. Guerini's eyebrows shot skyward. A grin chased the surprise. Technicians scrambled, verifying sensor outputs, numbers cascading from red to green. Marco caught Lila's eye. She gave a subtle nod. Told you so. Vitali stepped forward, face pale. He opened his mouth, but Guerini spoke first. Professor, may we verify torque values on those bolts? Of course, Vitali forced out. Marco handed over the torque wrench. A technician confirmed every reading matched spec. There was no sabotage this time, only results. Guerini took a slow breath, as if savoring the engine's scent. Mr. Rossi, he said, could we run a controlled ramp? I want to see resonance at 5,000 RPM. Marco nodded, fingers flying over the control panel. The engine's rumble climbed, rising through the room like an operatic tenor hitting. Perfect pitch. Still, the graphs stayed green. Minimal harmonic feedback. Stress well below failure threshold. Guerini exchanged a glance with his lead materials engineer, who mouthed a single word Marco caught anyway. Impossible. When the test cycle ended, Guerini killed the ignition himself. Silence rang louder than exhaust. He turned to Marco. How did you conceive this sleeve? Marco swallowed, voice steady. I listened to the engine. It told me where the echo was strongest. Copper's damping matched the harmonic frequency. Vitali interjected, desperate. Copper sleeves are primitive. They'll corrode unless treated with graphene-infused sealant. Marco finished for him. He produced a small vial from his pocket. Applied last night. Adds passive lubrication and corrosion resistance. Lila couldn't hide. Her smirk. Guerini looked between the two students, then at Vitale, measured, unreadable. "Professor, may I borrow Mr. Rossi and Miss Moretti for a follow-up assessment in Maranello tonight?" Vitale stammered. We have ongoing coursework. It will count as the most valuable coursework of their lives," Guerini said gently, but with authority that brooked no argument. Marco's heart hammered, excitement, disbelief, vindication all at once. He turned to Vitale. The professor's eyes looked glassy, pride fracturing under the weight of spectacle. For an instant Marco felt pity, but he remembered the loosened bolt, the mockery. He owed Vitale nothing except the lesson now unfolding. Talent blooms where respect is given, not where ego walls it off. Guerini swept an arm toward the exit. "We depart at 1800. Packed lightly," Lila elbowed Marco. "Guess we're skipping dinner hall." He laughed, a sound that felt strange on his lips after days of tight jaws. "I'll buy you roadside gelato on the way," he promised. They left. Whispers followed them like a wake through the crowd. Admiration, envy, shock. Marco didn't bask. He simply held the copper sleeve in his palm, feeling its cool weight. It wasn't just a sleeve. It was the voice of every ignored idea, every after-hours experiment, every quiet kid in the back row. And tonight, that voice was headed to Ferrari. Evening draped the campus in amber when Marco ducked into the machine shop one last time. He wanted to clean his bench, thank the tools that had been his companions. As he wiped down the lathe, footsteps approached. The janitor who'd occasionally offered coffee during late sessions. The old man adjusted his cap. "You did good, ragazzo. The whole building's talking." Marco smiled shyly. "Couldn't have without those extra shop hours you unlocked." The janitor shrugged. "Genius only needs a crack to slip through. Same with light." He offered his weathered hand. Marco shook it gratefully, heart swelling at the simple recognition. Not all mentors stood at lecterns. Outside, a crimson Ferrari shuttle van idled, its headlights cutting twin spears through dusk. Lila already sat inside, tapping messages to her mother about a small detour to Maranello. Marco climbed in and the doors hissed shut. As the van pulled from campus, he looked back at the looming silhouette of Politecnico di Torino. He thought of the boy who left Modena with grease-stained dreams, the man mocked before his peers, the engineer now barreling toward the birthplace of legends. He touched the copper sleeve in his backpack. The engine had spoken. The world had finally listened, and the night still had miles to run. The road to Maranello wound through hills like a coiled serpent, slicing through vineyards and olive groves, the golden hour turning every leaf to bronze. In the back of the Ferrari shuttle van, Marco sat in silence, staring out the window, hands clenched loosely in his lap. He had been quiet the entire ride. Not from fear this time, but awe. It had been years since he'd last seen the famed gates of Ferrari HQ. Back then, he had been a wide-eyed kid on a school trip, peering through the bars like a hungry orphan outside a banquet. Now he was driving through those same gates, this time as a guest. Lila nudged him from the seat beside him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marco exhaled. "Feels like I'm about to meet God." She grinned. "Relax. God just wants a better engine." Inside the engineering complex, the air buzzed not with noise but with intent. Glass partitions, separated workspaces where technicians hovered over engines like surgeons. Red and black liveries dominated every surface, from floor tiles to uniforms. Even the coffee smelled expensive. Guerini led them past a sleek display room filled with Ferrari's legacy, LaFerrari, F50, even the infamous 250 GTO gleaming under spotlight. They weren't just cars, they were history forged in steel and blood and noise. Marco felt small in their presence. He didn't realize they had entered the dyno control room until the door hissed shut behind them. A full team of engineers awaited, 10, maybe more, watching live sensor feeds on wall-sized monitors. At the center sat the power unit he had helped bring to life, the V12 prototype, now properly mounted, its shell painted gunmetal black. The copper sleeve had been cleaned, lacquered, and labeled as MRS Damper Prototype, his initials. The sight almost stopped his heart. Guerini faced the room. "This is Marco Rossi. He found the fault we missed. We're running his damper through stage 1 validation. Treat it like any other component. Question it, test it, push it to the brink." One of the older engineers raised an eyebrow. "What are his credentials?" Marco stiffened. Guerini answered without hesitation. "Credibility comes from results. And the only result that matters is that engine starting clean at 5,000 RPM. No one objected. The first tests were cautious. Idle to mid-RPM ramps, slow stress loads, telemetry sweeps. Marco, seated beside Lila in the control booth, answered every question thrown at him. On damping frequencies, thermal expansion coefficients, how he calculated resonance nodes by ear. By ear. That phrase made some snort at first, but the data silenced them. By midnight, the engine had been pushed to its previous failure limits and held. Not only was it stable, it was smoother. Noise signatures showed a 14% reduction in harmonic stress. Torque transfer was cleaner. Fuel delivery more consistent. Still, Marco knew what came next. The full-throttle torture cycle. The room dimmed as exhaust fans roared to life. Everyone fastened headsets. The engine screamed into higher RPMs, pushing past 7,000, 8,000. Graphs fluctuated. Lines trembled. The copper sleeve glowed dull red. Oil pressure holding, vibration holding, block temperature within limits. RPM at 9,100. Brace for resonance spike. At 9,300 RPM, where the engine had previously seized, a collective breath was held and passed. No spike. Just clean, brutal power. A spontaneous cheer erupted. Engineers clapping, slapping backs. Marco sat frozen, headset slipping off, eyes fixed on the V12 now slowly winding down. He felt weightless, like gravity had forgotten him. Lila leaned over, grinning ear to ear. "Well, genius. They just ran your fix on the most powerful engine." In Europe, one of the engineers approached Guerini. "We need this on Project Velocita. We've wasted 6 months trying to eliminate feedback from the hybrid torque junction. His sleeve just solved it." Guerini smiled. "Then let's make it official." By 2 Marco was seated in a boardroom drinking espresso that cost more than his monthly food budget. 2 patent lawyers and 3 Ferrari executives reviewed the design, discussed licensing terms, and proposed a junior fellowship. But Marco wasn't listening to most of it. Not really. His eyes kept wandering back to the small display in the corner, a freeze frame of the V12's final dyno run with a single phrase below it. Component, Rossi Moretti harmonic damping sleeve. Status, validated. Eventually, Guerini turned to him. "Mr. Rossi, you could license the design and return to university, or stay here as part of our power unit innovation team. The choice is yours." Marco didn't answer immediately. He thought of his father, alone in the Modena garage, watching the TV with greasy hands and eyes brimming with disbelief. Then he looked at Lila, who was already sketching sensor upgrades on a napkin like she belonged there. "I'll stay," Marco said, voice clear, "but only if Lila stays too. I didn't do this alone." Guerini chuckled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Ms. Moretti, welcome to Ferrari." Lila raised her espresso cup. "To rogue engineers and vindicated junk parts." 3 days later, a press release hit every major automotive news outlet. Ferrari partners with students on breakthrough damping tech for next-gen engines. Photos showed Marco and Lila in red coveralls beside Guerini, smiling beside the now famous V12. Social media exploded. Messages poured in. Former classmates offering congratulations. Professors awkwardly tagging him in LinkedIn posts. Even Vitale. The professor sent a private message. "Marco, I reviewed the press release. I misjudged you and your method. It was never personal, but I owe you an apology, publicly or privately. Your fix was elegant, and I see now effective." Professor Vitale Marco stared at it for a long moment. He didn't reply. Instead, he opened a new tab and uploaded the final resonance analysis to the university's engineering forum with one line. "There is logic in intuition and intelligence in listening. 1 week later, Marco returned to the Modena garage. His father stood frozen behind the counter when he saw the red overalls. "I knew it," Giuseppe muttered, voice thick. "Even when they laughed at you, I knew." Marco didn't speak. He just opened the hood of the old Fiat Spider that had first taught him to feel engines, and in the quiet, with his father beside him and the warm scent of motor oil hanging in the air, Marco pressed his ear to the block. It was still whispering, only now the world had finally learned to listen. The assembly line at Ferrari hummed like a symphony in motion, robotic arms gliding, rivet guns firing in rhythm, and engines pulsing to life one by one. And there, amidst the sleek choreography of machines and men, stood Marco Rossi in his red overalls, hands clasped behind his back, eyes watching an engine settle into its chassis. He had been at Ferrari for just over a month, and yet his signature already lived inside every new V12 block rolling off the line, his copper sleeve, now mass-produced and factory-sealed, bearing a tiny laser-etched insignia, MR Internal Damper V1.0. The engineers had insisted on the label. Marco had protested until Guerini told him bluntly, "History has to know who listened first." The factory floor manager, a stout man with kind eyes, waved Marco over. "Final test run on Unit 214. Want the honors?" Marco nodded and stepped forward. The ignition sequence was familiar now, but the sound never grew old. When the engine fired up, it did so with the smoothness of a whisper, the resonance curve displayed on the monitor like a heartbeat. Flat, perfect. He closed his eyes, still listening, still learning. That afternoon, Marco and Lila walked through the design lab toward Guerini's office. Lila, as usual, was multitasking, typing with one hand while balancing a cappuccino in the other. "You know," she said, "they're asking for interviews. Tech blogs, auto magazines. Even the dean wants us back for a guest lecture." Marco winced. "I barely survived my own lab presentations. I'd combust in front of cameras." Lila laughed. "Good thing I'm here to translate your genius into human language." They entered Guerini's office, where the engineer stood beside a table cluttered with blueprints. He gestured for them to sit. "Project Velocità has cleared prototype phase," he said, "and thanks to your damping solution, we're hitting torque targets we thought were fantasy 3 months ago." Marco blinked. "Already?" Guerini smiled. "Your work accelerated everything. Now we're preparing a concept debut at the Geneva Auto Show. We want you two on stage when we unveil the power unit." Lila let out a low whistle. "From lecture, whole disasters to international spotlights. That's one hell of a glow-up." Guerini paused, more serious now. "Also, we've decided to name the new damper module after the original project title, the Rossi Moretti Sleeve, officially." Marco looked at Lila. She grinned. "It has a nice ring to it," she said. "Almost sounds like a law firm or a revolution." The news spread quickly. The Geneva Auto Show became their proving ground. On the day of the debut, Marco stood backstage in a custom-cut Ferrari suit, feeling completely out of place. Lights flashed, cameras clicked, and in the distance, the concept car shimmered under a silk cover, codenamed Veloci Uno. Beneath its sculpted hood purred the engine born from late nights, failure, sabotage, and intuition. As the reveal began, Guerini took the stage and introduced the team behind the innovation. When it was Marco's turn to speak, his palms went cold, but Lila gave him a nod from the side. So he stepped up, took a breath, and began not with specs or science, but with a story. "I grew up listening to engines," he told the packed auditorium, "not studying them, not reading about them, just listening. My father taught me that machines speak, softly, patiently, and only to those who give them time. When I joined Politecnico, I thought I'd finally learn to speak their language better. Instead, I was told I was wrong, told that intuition didn't belong in engineering." He paused. "But this engine behind me, it runs because I trusted what I heard, because I didn't ignore what others called noise." There was silence, then thunderous applause. Back at the university, things had changed. Politecnico di Torino's faculty hosted a public recognition ceremony. Marco and Lila were awarded honorary research fellowships. Guerini spoke as guest of honor. Even Professor Vitale attended, silent, withdrawn, but present. After the ceremony, as students swarmed Marco with questions, Vitale approached him privately. He extended his hand. "I was wrong." Marco hesitated, then shook it. "Thank you," Marco said simply, "but not just for that. You forced me to trust myself." Vitale nodded, humbled. "I hope you'll come back and teach someday." Marco smiled. "Maybe, but only if we install a copper sleeve on your lectern first. Stop those vibrations of pride." For once, Vitale laughed. Weeks later, Marco returned to Modena, not as a visitor, but as a son bringing back a gift. The red 296 GTB rolled into the alley behind Rossi Motori, its engine silent as a sleeping beast. Giuseppe stepped out from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes wide. "You drove that here?" Marco tossed him the keys. "It's yours." "Well, for a day. Ferrari lent it for a promo shoot." Giuseppe looked at the car, then at his son. "She sounds clean, real clean." "Copper clean," Marco said. They laughed together, and for a long time stood under the awning in silence, father and son, Greece and genius, past and future. That night Marco sat alone beside the old Fiat Spider, the one that started it all's. Hood was open. Its engine, weathered and worn, waited patiently. Marco reached down and ran his fingers over its block, rusted, imperfect, familiar. He hadn't touched it in weeks. But now he wanted to, not to fix it, just to listen, and there it was, still whispering, not like before. Now it whispered, "Thank you." Months passed. The Rossi Moretti sleeve became a standard in performance engine design. Other automakers followed. Suit. Marco was invited to symposiums, featured in magazines, but he stayed grounded, splitting his time between Ferrari's labs and quiet weekends in Modena, helping his father with small-town repairs. Lila eventually led her own department in Ferrari's hybrid systems unit. She built tools that listened, sensors, algorithms, interfaces that treated the engine as something alive. And every year at the university's mechanical engineering graduation, Marco returned to give one lecture. He never brought slides. He brought an old piston and a copper sleeve, held them up, and told his story. Because sometimes the world needs reminding that genius doesn't always shout. Sometimes it listens.